Now, when we remove items from the cart, we want to get a state in action because, again, we'll get some extra payload that helps us identify the item that should be removed. And here I expect that my payload is just the ID of the item. I can expect this because I'm the one writing this code here. And with that, we now want to find that item and remove it from the array. Now, we don't need to check if it's part of the array. We know that it will be part, but we need to find out how many items are in the array. So for this, again, I'll get my existing item by reaching out to state.items and finding the item where the item ID is equal to the ID I'm getting as a payload. And then we want to check if existing item.quantity is 1. If it's 1, then we want to remove the item from the array entirely. If it's greater than 1, we just want to reduce the quantity by 1. So the else case is simpler. In the else case that we have more than one item, we just reach out to the quantity and decrease it by 1. But if the quantity is 1, we want to remove the item from the array. And we can do this by setting state items equal to state items.filter and then filter out that one item that we want to remove. That overrides the array of items with a new array where this item which we want to remove will be missing. And it will be missing because we filter for the item where the item ID is not equal to ID. So we keep all the items where the IDs do not match the one ID we're trying to remove. And therefore, for the item where the ID is equal, we'll filter that out and remove it therefore. That's how we can update these items to remove the one item that should be removed from the array whilst keeping all the other items. And that logic should work. I guess we're going to see it once we test it, but it does look good to me. Now here's a quick note from Max from the future. I forgot one important step here, which you should add and which I will add later in this module, but which is missing at the moment. When we remove an item from the cart and the item is still part of the cart, so the quantity wasn't 1, then just updating the quantity as I'm doing it here is not enough. We also should update the total price of that item. And we do so by adding existing item.total price, total price, and setting that equal to existing item.total price minus existing item.price. So deducting the price of a single unit from the total price, since we are removing one unit. That's a line of code you should add here. I have not added it here. Again, I will add it later in this module because I overlooked it here. I'm just showing it to you right now because, of course, you should have that extra line in there. Now I'll store this slice in another constant, the cart slice, and of course we'll export it here. We'll export it as a file default, and we will also export the actions because, of course, we will need to dispatch those actions. So I export a named export here. I add a named export, exporting a constant, which I'll name cart actions, where I access cart slice.actions. Now in index.js, I want to merge this new slice into my overall Redux store. So I'll import cart slice from /cart slice and add this as another reducer in my reducer map. Maybe we use cart as a key here, and then here point at cart slice.reducer. Okay, with that we added this as well. Now let's wire it up. And for wiring it up, I actually need real products. In products.js, I have a hard-coded product here, and that makes no sense. This should be generated dynamically so that we have real product data with which we can work. Now we could manage our products with Redux as well. That might be a nice practice, setting up another slice for products. But since we don't do anything with the products, since we don't add or delete products, I'll instead just add a dummy products array here in the products component, which is an array, and I'll set up my dummy product data there. Now every product should have an ID, because in the cart slice, we are working with that ID here, and we should therefore also have a price and a title then. And hence here I'll add an ID, let's say an ID of P1 and a price of 6 and a title of my first book. And then also a description because we need that down there for outputting the product item. So I'll add a description of the first book I ever wrote. It's just some dummy data, so I'm not spending too much time on preparing the best possible data here. Now I will add another product with an ID P2 and a price of 5, which is my second book. I'm super inspired, as you can tell. So that's the second book I ever wrote, and now we got some dummy data. Now I want to use that dummy data to dynamically render these product items. So here in the unordered list, I'll map all those dummy products into product items. So I'll paste that in there and set title equal to product.title, set the price equal to product.price, and you guessed it, set the description equal to product description. And since we're mapping, give every product item a key of product.id to help react. So now we got the product data. We can now work with that data. And I want to start inside of the product item. There I have the Add to Cart button. And we want to wire this button up to this function, to the Add Item to Cart function in our cart slice. So in product item, I will add a new function here, Add to Cart handler, where I want to dispatch the appropriate action. Now, of course, we still dispatch actions as we learned it, so we import use dispatch from React Redux to get access to this dispatch function by then executing use dispatch in the product item. And then here in add to cart handler, I call dispatch, and now we need to get access to the cart actions. So I will import cart actions from going up, store cart slice, and then here dispatch cart actions dot add item to cart. Now we again execute this action creator function, but now we also need to pass data to it, because we now want to pass that product, which should be added, to that add item to cart function. We are expecting it there. Now there we need to work with the ID and price, and we need the title, so we should make sure that we send all that data. Now in product item I do have the title and the price, but not the ID. So I will also expect the ID as a prop now, and in products.js I will forward the ID, like this, so that we have it available inside of product item, and therefore inside of product item, when we add an item to the cart here, I pass an object as a payload to this action, and this object has an ID field which points at this ID which we're extracting from props, and we can therefore also use the shortcut and do the same for title and for price, so that this is the object we are dispatching. And again, I'm using that modern JavaScript shortcut here, where when the key name and the variable name holding the value are equal, we can omit the right side of that property assignment and just write down those property names, and it's automatically expanded behind the scenes. So we can just write it like this. This will now dispatch all the data we need to dispatch, and therefore we can now connect add to cart handler to our button. So here we add on click, and then point at the add to cart handler. If we do this, and I reload, that should work, but we can't tell because we're not really updating the cart, and we're not updating the badge here either. So let's maybe start with the badge, and for this, let's again go to the cart button component. There we already dispatch, now we also need data from the cart. We need the total quantity. And speaking of that, I just remembered that I forgot to update the total quantity. When we add an item to the cart, we don't just want to update the existing item, or the items array to be precise, we also want to update the total quantity field. And therefore, we can simply say that no matter if we have an existing item or not, the total quantity will simply increase by 1. We have one more item in the cart. That is safe. And the same is true for remove item from cart. No matter if we have that item in the cart once or multiple times, we definitely want to reduce the total quantity by 1. So we should add this code to remove item from cart. And with that, back in the cart button, we can now read data from the state by also importing use selector and then selecting a piece of data. So we call use selector, pass this function for selecting data from the state, and dive into state.cart, .cart because in index.js here, we gave this a cart key, and then into the properties we set up in the state of our cart slice. So in this case, we're interested in the total quantity. Hence here we dive into state.cart.total quantity and store this in a, let's say, cart quantity constant. And now it's that cart quantity constant which will output down there. With all that done, if we now save this, if I reload, if I add items to the cart, that badge on the top right corner updates. Now let's make sure we render this cart correctly, and for that we need to go to the cart.js file. There I have this list of cart items, and at the moment it's hard-coded. So again, here we want to use Redux instead and tap into our Redux managed cart state. So since we need data from Redux, we need to import use selector and import that from React Redux. And then here call use selector and access state.cart. And then there dive into our items because we want those cart items like this. And then we can output them here. We can map our cart items into cart item components. And here, that cart item expects an item prop, which holds an object of this shape. And the good thing is that in cart slice, we already are setting up cart items with a certain structure where we do have a price and a quantity and a total price and so on. And therefore we now just need to translate those properties which we have in our Redux store, in our Redux state, to the properties expected here. So we create an item on the fly, which we pass as an item to cart item, and the title should be item.title here. The quantity should be item.quantity. Since in the Redux state, I am using quantity as a key as well. But I'm not using title as I just see, I'm using name. So in cart.js here, we should reference item.name, since item is the data coming from Redux. Now the total price will be item dot, let's have a look, total price. So we want to access item.total price, and the single item price is item.price. So that's now the item which we pass into cart item for every item we're getting from Redux here. Let's see if that works. If we save this, yeah, I can reload. Let's see. I got multiple items here, so that doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to get that we have an existing item. And I think I know why. If we have a look at cart slice, I'm getting an existing item by comparing the ID of the stored item to the new item ID. The problem with that is that I'm storing the item ID in an item ID field here. So we should just change this to just ID here, so that when we extract the ID, we are successful. And if we do that and reload, if I now add the same item multiple times, it is grouped together. So now this is working, and we have to add a second item to have a second entry. And then that is also grouped together if we add more and more items. So that's working. We also should go to cart.js and make sure that when we create multiple cart items here, we do add that key again and point at item ID as a unique identifier. That has nothing to do with Redux, but helps React, as you learned earlier in the course. So now we got that. Let's now make sure the minus and plus buttons in our cart items work. And for this, we need to dive into the cart item and dispatch actions when they are clicked. So you know how that works. We import use dispatch from React Redux, and we need our cart actions. So I'll import cart actions from going up, store cart slice. And then here in cart item, we call use dispatch to get access to that dispatch function. And we then add new functions which will be wired up to these buttons. Let's say the remove item handler, and then also the add item handler. Now, let's start with the remove item handler, and let's dispatch that remove action. For this, we need cart actions dot remove item from cart, and that action wants a payload. It wants the ID as a payload. So we should make sure that this is passed on, and for this we need to accept the ID as a prop in cart item, and in cart.js again make sure that we pass it as a prop. So actually here in this item object which we're creating, I'll add the ID field and use item.id. And now inside of cart item, we get this ID here, and we can now pass this as a payload to the remove item from cart action. Now for adding an item, we want to dispatch cart actions add item to cart and execute that. And here we again need to pass in that object which add item to cart expects, this object, which should have an ID and a price and a title field. So back in cart item, this object will get an ID field with this ID. It will get a title field with that title, and also the price field with that price. Like this. Now we just need to wire up these functions to our buttons. So on the first button, the minus button, I'll connect the remove item handler to onClick. And on the second button, it's the add item handler. And with that, if we save this, if I now reload again, I can add items, toggle my cart, and add them multiple times, also add them with this plus button, and also remove them with the minus. And if only one item is left and I click minus, it's removed entirely. So this is now working, and that's again Redux in action. It's nothing new, it's only what we learned thus far, but therefore it's of course a great practice. But now in the next lecture, let's add some async code and let's see how we can deal with that when working with Redux. So now that we repeated these core Redux basics again, let's dive into some brand new content. And let's see how we can connect Redux with side effects and asynchronous code. Now for this, I'll continue using this basic application on which we worked, but now I want to add a backend, a server to which we can send our cart. Because my idea is that whenever I edit the cart, because we add items or we reduce the quantity or remove items, whenever that happens, I want to send a request to a backend server to store that updated cart on the backend, so that when we reload this front-end application, we can fetch that saved cart from the server, load it, and display it here. That is my goal. Now for that, as a backend, I will again use Firebase because it's that easy to use, no backend code required backend, which simply, well, makes our life as a developer a bit easier. Of course, if you are a Node.js developer, you could also build your own backend API and send requests to that, but that's simply not the focus of this course. Node.js is a totally different topic. I got a dedicated course on this. This course is about React instead, so we will focus on that. So therefore, I'm back on Firebase, using that Firebase project I created earlier in the course. And there I have that real-time database where some data is already being stored from an earlier course section. Now I'm going to get rid of all that data because we don't need it here. And instead now I'll use this backend here for my requests for this application. And now we get a couple of different kinds of requests that should be sent to that backend. As I said, whenever the card changes, I want to update it on the backend. So whenever I add or remove items to or from the card, I want to update that backend. And when I reload the application, I want to fetch my stored data from the backend. Because currently, if we add something to the card, if we edit our card, once I reload, all that data is lost. Because currently we're not storing that card anywhere. And that's exactly the kind of problem I want to solve by storing it on that Firebase backend. But how do we now integrate that backend and the HTTP requests that we need to send to that backend into our React application that uses Redux? How do we do that? Now keep in mind, reducers must be pure, side effect free, and synchronous. So when we have any code that produces a side effect or is asynchronous, like sending a HTTP request, such code must not go into our reducer functions. So we can't send our HTTP request inside of the reducers in our card slice after we edited our state here. We can't go to the end of the reducer and then use the fetch API and send a request to the backend. This would totally be against the idea of Redux. It would be super bad, and you must never do something like this. Don't perform a side effect inside of your reducer. No matter if it's synchronous or asynchronous, don't do it inside of the reducer. And never run any asynchronous code in the reducer in general. So we can't send the HTTP request here after we're done updating our state. Instead, when it comes to running such code, we have two main options where to put such code. We can execute it in the components, so we can simply ignore Redux if you want to call it like this. Or we create something which is called an action creator, which we only used indirectly thus far, which also would allow us to run asynchronous code or generally any side effect code. These are our two main options. Now I want to show you both options so that you see the differences and can make your own choice which option you prefer.